Citizens of Texas, you have realized the horrors of anarchy and the dictation of military rule. Your rights must be defended.
Who waged war against the Mexican nation have violated all laws and do not deserve any consideration.
Congress doth consent that the Republic of Texas may be erected into a new state, to be called the
find a
state
more
of Texas.
unjust act. To rob a friendly
American
nation like
blood
Mexico.
upon the American soil.
They have declared a war of extermination against the Mexican
The
nation.
two nations are at war.
Antes de la Guerra México era un país joven, una nación recién nacida, mientras, por ejemplo, vemos las naciones europeas, que tardaron siglos en constituirse como naciones, como estados nacionales. México, de buenas a primeras, en 1821, nació como país independiente. Y, por supuesto, la juventud fue costosa, porque había una grave inmadurez política.
Between 1833 and 1855, the executive changed hands 36 times. The average tenure of office was 7.5 months. The Mexican governing structure changed over time, but by 1824, a federal republic was established, and the 1824 Constitution was written.
In the beginning of the 19th century, the United States was thinking about expanding beyond its original borders.
But what really changed the situation was the development of what we call manifest destiny, this renewed desire, really fervor in the United States to gain more land.
It's more than just a political philosophy of expansionism. It really is connected to the idea that the Anglo-American race was really destined and favored by God to control most of the continent.
When Texas was part of the colony, it was sparsely populated.
And a lot of Americans went into Texas during the 1820s because that land in the Houston area was very, very good land for cotton.
By 1835, there were 30,000 approximately U.S. settlers and only about 7,800 Mexican settlers.
As the state became more populated, the Mexican government, and specifically Santa Anna, became concerned about the possible independence of that area.
So in 1836, he is behind the rewriting of a constitution. It means that Texas is going to have even less of a voice in its own destiny than it had under the federal constitution.
Citizens of Texas, you have realized the horrors of anarchy and the dictation of military rule. Your rights must be defended. The oppressor must be driven from our soil.
All of these things have the effect of angering the Texans, and the state of Texas declares independence. Then you have Santa Anna racing north, and then we have the famous battle at the Alamo, which is really the most remembered, but sort of one of the least significant parts of the whole fight for Texas independence.
After the Battle of the Alamo, Santa Anna moved north, and Sam Houston decisively defeated him at the Battle of San Jacinto, which basically established Texas independence.
Texas independence eventually leads to the Mexican War, albeit a decade later. From the moment Texas became independent, a significant number of Texans wanted to be annexed to the United States.
The fact that there were so many slaves in Texas and it was such a large territory really made Northerners nervous about adding it to the United States because of the number of votes in Congress and how it would sway the balance of slave states and free states. Texas is allowed to continue as a republic until the presidential election of 1844, in which James K. Polk was a dark horse candidate, and he wins on a platform of annexation and expansionism.
Foreign powers do not seem to appreciate the true character of our government. To enlarge its limits is to extend the dominions of peace over additional territories and increasing the millions.
The sitting president, Tyler, a lame duck, went ahead and took the leap and annexed Texas with their agreement, which would come a few months later, and the Texans passed it in the legislature.
And here's where the problems with the United States and Mexico really come to a head, because there's a boundary dispute as to what should be the recognized international boundary.
The Mexican government viewed the Nueces River as the demarcation line for Texas. The Americans had always gone on the line that was the Rio Grande. President Polk sent Zachary Taylor to the Rio Grande and had him go to work building a fort facing the biggest town on the river on the Mexican side, Matamoros. The fort became Fort Texas. And this action was provocative enough that Mexican forces in the area would eventually run headlong into the Americans and trigger the war.
After reiterated menaces, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon the American soil. She has proclaimed that hostilities have commenced and that the two nations are at war.
When the first news dribbled in about the combat along the Rio Grande River and the first casualties were listed, one of the first names that shows up was Major Jacob Brown. This probably wouldn't be significant in anybody's history except for Arkansas history, is that Arkansans thought of him as an Arkansan. He had been the president of the state bank at one point in time, he had lived in Little Rock, and so this was a man they considered their own. There weren't a ton of American casualties, but one of them was a man they knew very, very well. And it was going to fan the recruitment of Arkansas soldiers even before the president called for Arkansas soldiers. The decision was made then to launch a three-prong attack in taking Mexican territory. One of those prongs was a relatively small force that set out for California. Two prongs, one set out for North Mexico under General Zachary Taylor. Fighting went on throughout North Mexico in Monterey and eventually Buena Vista, where Arkansans were involved outside of Saltillo. Another force set out for the port city of Veracruz on the east coast of Mexico and go inland. Battles were fought at Cerro Gordo, a mountainous area along the National Road on the route in. More battles were fought in the suburbs of Mexico City, places that came to be known as Contreras and Churubusco, eventually fighting their way up the causeways to the very heart of Mexico City.
Tomada aún la capital de la República, el gobierno no se ponía de acuerdo, las cámaras no se ponían de acuerdo, hasta que finalmente, visto todas las implicaciones, los problemas que suponía tener un ejército de ocupación en varias posiciones del país, más la capital de la República, fue lo que obligó al gobierno mexicano a firmar finalmente el Tratado de Guadalupe Hidalgo.
Who would ever have imagined that 3 centuries after the death of a great conquistador, Cortés, the city that he raised from its foundations would be occupied by an army from a nation that had then not even begun to exist?
I think the Mexican population is demoralized after this war. They have lost half of their territory. Their economy is again in disarray.
En algunas historias se habla de que se cede el territorio a Estados Unidos. No, no. El territorio fue el botín de la guerra, sin duda. Y México lo tuvo que entregar porque perdió a la guerra. Y no tuvo otra alternativa.
Nowhere in the annals of modern history can one find a more unjust act. To rob a friendly nation like Mexico of so large a portion of her territory.
And the most ironic thing about all of this is that 9 days after the treaty was signed, gold is struck in California. By that point, it's part of the United States.
With the end of the Mexican-American War, the United States expanded its borders all the way to California, and it expanded the problems of slavery all the way with it.
The United States is in the same position that Mexico had been in 1836, having some of its states declare that they're not going to follow the policies of the central government and secede. And the United States does what Mexico did and ends up going to war.
The war with Mexico became a training ground for the Civil War. It trained men like Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, Jefferson Davis, P.G.T. Beauregard, Stonewall Jackson. All had fought in Mexico, all knew each other personally, and all would go on to be combatants.